October 1951. The sky over northwestern Korea, a desolate stretch of frozen river and mountain known only by its nickname, MiG Alley, was the most dangerous patch of air on planet Earth. It was here, in the first jet-powered war, that the American century clashed head-on with the Soviet Empire. But officially, that clash never happened. To the world, it was a police action. To the men in the cockpits, it was a desperate secret war. And for one American pilot, Captain Gill Garrett, this crisp autumn morning was supposed to be a milestone. He was flying his 97th combat sortie in his F-86 Sabre, bearing the number 49 to 1319. Just 3 more missions. That was all that stood between him and the end of his tour. 3 more chances to get home alive to his family. Garrett was a veteran of the 336th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, a unit that had already bloodied the nose of the Communist air forces. He had flown 35 engagements. He had even sent a MiG home with serious damage. He was good. And he was lucky. So far. That morning, his flight of Sabres slipped into the cold, thin air over the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and the sanctuary of Manchuria. They were the hunters. But deep in the cockpit of a MiG-15, watching them ascend, someone else was doing the hunting. His name was Yevgeny Georgievich Popeliev. To the Americans who would encounter him, he was simply a ghost, an unknown enemy in a red-nosed jet. But behind the Soviet controls, Popeliev was a colonel, the commander of the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment, and he was one of the best pilots the Soviets never admitted to sending to Korea. His path to this moment had been a lifetime of frustration and patience. Born in eastern Siberia, the son of a railroad worker, he had spent the Great Patriotic War, what we call World War II, stuck in the Far East, begging his superiors to send him to fight the Germans. His requests were denied again and again, even after his beloved brother Konstantin was shot down and killed by the Luftwaffe. While Soviet aces like Ivan Kozadub were racking up scores over Berlin, Popeliev was flying reconnaissance and training missions. He watched the war pass him by. But history had a way of offering second chances. By 1950, the Cold War had turned hot on the Korean peninsula. Stalin, desperate to test his new jet technology against the West but terrified of triggering a global war, made a secret pact. Soviet pilots, flying Soviet jets, would defend communist North Korea, but they would do so in Chinese uniforms, speaking Korean on the radios, wearing altered insignia. If one of them was shot down, Moscow would deny everything. They were ghosts. By the spring of 1951, Popeliev's regiment had been secretly deployed to the sprawling base at Antung, in Manchuria, just a few minutes flying time from the alley. His men were the elite of the Soviet Air Force, and he drilled them mercilessly. But there was a problem. The order to speak Korean in combat was crippling. In the chaos of a dogfight, men revert to instinct. They curse in their mother tongue. When the Americans first arrived in force, the language barrier nearly cost the Soviets the air battle. Popeliev, ever the pragmatist, finally snapped. He later recalled telling his Soviet superiors, "It was impossible psychologically in the heat of battle to use a foreign language you hardly knew. So after a week or two we just decided to ignore the order." The top brass started complaining, so I told them, "Go and fight yourselves." With the shackles off, the 196th Regiment transformed. By April, they were ambushing American B-29 superfortresses, sending the massive bombers tumbling from the sky in flames. Popeliev himself was a patient killer. He wasn't flashy. He was methodical. He studied the American Sabre, its strengths, its weaknesses. He knew the F-86 could outturn him in a horizontal dogfight if he was careless. But in a diving zoom climb, with the MiG's superior thrust, he held the advantage. He taught his men to fight not with reckless courage, but with geometry. With traps. So, on the morning of October 6, when Captain Garrett and his wingmen spotted 2 MiG-15s darting through a gap in the clouds over the Yalu, it looked like an opportunity. Easy prey. The 2 Sabres rolled in, throttles forward, chasing the communist jets southward. Garrett's radio crackled with the familiar sounds of the hunt. He focused on the fleeing MiGs, pushing his Sabre faster. In his mind, he was the aggressor. But 10,000 feet above, hidden in the glare of the sun, Yevgeny Popeliev was watching the trap close. He wasn't fleeing. He was positioning. Garrett later remembered the moment his world turned upside down. The 2 MiGs had led us straight into a trap. They had 2 buddies who now were cutting down on us from our flank at a time when we were at our lowest airspeed. He never saw the red nose of Popeliev's MiG-15 until it was too late. A MiG bore down on me, Garrett recounted, and began firing with his 37mm and 23mm cannons. I could see that mean-looking red-nose gun flash when my ship bucked, skidded around and headed down. Stern. A 37mm shell, a chunk of metal the size of a milk bottle designed to shred bomber formations, slammed into the engine of Garrett's Sabre just behind the right wing. The force of the blast was so violent it threw the jet into a flat spin. 1 second, Gill Garrett was a hunter. The next, he was tumbling through the sky, trapped in a cockpit with a dead engine, the wind screaming past his canopy, watching the icy ground rush up to meet him. He was, in his own words, holding a GI insurance policy due to mature. High above, Yevgeny Popeliev pulled up from his firing pass, watching the American Sabre spiral down.
He had done his job.
He had protected the sanctuary. For him, it was just another victory in a war his country denied existed. But for Captain Garrett, stranded in the sky, the fight was just beginning. He had to decide, ride the spinning metal coffin down, or trust his life to a parachute over enemy territory, knowing that if the Soviets caught him, he would simply vanish. At 8,000 meters, with his Sabre locked in a flat spin and a 37mm hole in his fuselage, Captain Gill Garrett had one thought: get out. He reached down, grabbed the face curtain of his ejection seat, and pulled.
Nothing happened. He pulled again.
The mechanism, crippled by the same cannon shell that had shredded his engine, refused to fire.
He was trapped.
Later, in the sterile language of an official report, it would be noted that the ejection seat was inoperative. But in that cockpit, with the G-forces pressing him into his seat and the frozen landscape of North Korea spinning wildly outside his canopy, it was a death sentence. The only option left was as old as flight itself. He had to try to fly the wreck down. I fought to regain control, Garrett would remember. With every ounce of strength, he kicked the rudder, wrestled the stick, fighting the Sabre's natural instinct to spiral into the earth. At just 3,000 meters, the spin finally broke.
The wings bit into the air.
He was flying barely. But the engine was dead. The coastline was miles away. He was a glider with a 6-ton airframe, sinking fast over enemy territory. High above, Colonel Popeliev circled, watching the crippled Sabre level out and head for the sea.
He had done his job.
He had no idea that his well-placed burst of cannon fire had just gifted the Soviet Union something more valuable than a kill, a treasure chest. Down on the deck, Garrett was running out of sky. The Yellow Sea was his only hope. He aimed for the water, hoping to ditch and be picked up by rescue forces. But the ocean was deceptive. As he crossed the coastline near Sakhalin Bay, he realized the water wasn't water at all. It was a tidal flat, a vast shallow mudplain exposed by the receding tide.
There was no splashdown coming, just a skid. The F-86 Sabre, Bureau number 49 bis 1319, hit the mud flat with a jarring, twisting force.
It slid, throwing up a rooster tail of black ooze, before lurching to a stop, relatively intact. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of a canopy jettisoning. Garrett scrambled out onto the wing, sinking ankle-deep in the muck, and ran. He didn't look back at his jet. He just ran for the seawall for cover for his life.
He was lucky.
An Air Force SA-16 Albatross seaplane, piloted by a man with nerves of steel, spotted him and landed right on the mud flat, a maneuver that should have torn the plane apart. Under sporadic fire from North Korean troops on the shore, Garrett sprinted for the rescue craft, threw himself aboard, and the Albatross clawed its way back into the air.
He was safe. He was alive. He was going home.
But behind him, sitting alone on the mud like a beached whale, was the most advanced American fighter in the world. And everyone knew it.
The moment Popeliev landed back at Antung, the debriefing began.
When the intelligence officers heard that the Sabre had gone down intact on the mud flats, the atmosphere in the room changed. This wasn't just a victory, it was an opportunity. The Soviet Union had been desperate to get their hands on a serviceable F-86. They knew the MiG-15 was a deadly weapon, but the Sabre had something they didn't: an advanced radar-ranging gun sight, superior high-altitude performance, and hydraulic flight controls that made it a dream to fly. If they could study that aircraft, they could find its weaknesses. They could build a better MiG. Popeliev's regiment was immediately tasked with a new mission: establish absolute air superiority over that patch of coastline. No American aircraft could be allowed to interfere. On the ground, a recovery team was scrambled. They had to move fast before the incoming tide, before American bombers arrived to destroy the wreck, and before the U.S. Navy could get there first. They had perhaps 24 hours. That night, under a moonless sky, the operation began. Hundreds of Chinese laborers, conscripted from nearby villages, were marched onto the mudflat. They carried wooden poles, ropes, and makeshift sleds. Soviet technicians, bundled against the cold, directed them. The tide was coming in, and they had to move the massive fighter to higher ground. It was a scene from another century: a modern jet fighter, the pinnacle of American aviation technology, being dragged through the muck by hundreds of peasant farmers chanting in unison. As they worked, American search planes droned overhead. Naval guns boomed in the distance, shells landing perilously close. But the work continued. By dawn, as the first light touched the water, the Sabre was hidden under camouflage netting at the edge of the tree line, ready for disassembly. The trap had not only caught a pilot, it had caught a war prize beyond measure. And on the other side of the lines, Gill Garrett, sipping coffee on a rescue ship, had no idea that his abandoned jet was about to spark a secret technological arms race that would change the face of aerial combat. The question now was, could the Soviets get it out before the Americans blew it to pieces? While Captain Gill Garrett was being debriefed on a U.S. Navy ship, still trembling from his escape, a very different kind of operation was unfolding 50 miles behind enemy lines. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of North Korean laborers, directed by Soviet technicians, had done the impossible. They had dragged a 6-ton American fighter jet off a tidal flat, disassembled it, loaded it onto trucks, and spirited it away before the U.S. Air Force could send bombers to destroy it. By the time a flight of B-26 invaders arrived to strafe the crash site, all they found was empty mud and the deep scars of drag marks leading toward the tree line.
The Sabre was gone.
It was already on a train destination, Moscow. The prize arrived at the Soviet Union's premier aviation research center, TSAGI, just outside Moscow, in late October 1951. For the engineers who unerrated it, it was like opening a time capsule from the future. The F-86 Sabre, Bureau number 49 to 1319, was not just another captured machine. It was a Rosetta Stone. For 4 months, a team of the Soviet Union's brightest minds picked the aircraft apart. They measured every rivet, analyzed every alloy, traced every hydraulic line. The Americans had long suspected the Soviets were copying their technology, but this was different. This was a masterclass in reverse engineering, delivered directly to the Kremlin's doorstep.
What did they find?
The most coveted secret was the Sabres and APG-30 radar-ranging gun sight.
The MiG-15 relied on a simple optical sight.
A pilot had to estimate range, guess the lead, and pray. The Sabre's computer, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary for 1951, automatically calculated the distance to the target and adjusted the aiming point. It meant an American pilot could open fire at longer range and hit with his first burst, while a MiG pilot had to close to nearly point-blank range to be sure of his aim. Now, Soviet engineers could see exactly how it worked. But the secrets didn't stop there. They studied the Sabre's hydraulic control system, which made the heavy fighter feel light and responsive in the pilot's hands, a stark contrast to the MiG's heavier manual controls at high speed. They analyzed the fuel system, the wiring, the riveting patterns. They even copied the American G-suit, a crucial piece of gear that kept pilots from blacking out under high G-forces. When the final report was issued on June 19, 1952, it landed on the desks of men who reported directly to Joseph Stalin. The conclusions were stark. The Americans had built a superior airframe in several key areas. The Kremlin's response was immediate. Stalin personally ordered the creation of a Soviet Sabre, a direct copy of the F-86, to be built within a year.
The task fell to designer Vladimir Kondratyov.
His mission, replicate the American fighter down to the last bolt. But as his team dug deeper, they realized it wasn't that simple. American manufacturing techniques, the quality of aluminum alloys, the precision of the electronics, these were not just designs. They were the product of an entire industrial ecosystem that the Soviet Union, despite its might, could not simply duplicate overnight. Ultimately, the Soviet Sabre project was abandoned after Stalin's death in 1953. But the intelligence gained from 49 to 1319 was not wasted. Its DNA appeared in improved versions of the MiG-17 and influenced the development of the supersonic MiG-19. The radar gunsight technology, the hydraulic refinements, the understanding of American design philosophy, all of it flowed into the Soviet aviation industry, shortening years of research and development. And what of the Americans? They knew the jet had been captured. They knew the Soviets were studying it. But they had no idea how much had been learned. In Washington, the loss was quietly written off as an unfortunate incident. No one wanted to admit that the crown jewel of American aviation technology was now sitting in a hangar outside Moscow, being measured by the enemy. For Yevgeny Popelyev, the man who started it all with that single, perfectly aimed burst of cannon fire, the capture of the Sabre was the crowning achievement of his war. He would finish the Korean conflict as the top-scoring Soviet ace of the entire war, with 19 official victories, though he always humbly claimed only a handful, insisting the rest belonged to his wingmen. The Sabre he damaged now sits somewhere in a Russian archive, its ultimate fate unknown, a ghost of a war that never officially happened. But the story does not end there. Because on the other side of the world, the Americans were still trying to even the score. They wanted a MiG-15 just as badly, and they were willing to pay any price to get one. By the spring of 1953, the war in Korea had settled into a brutal stalemate. On the ground, men died for hills with names like Pork Chop and Old Baldy. In the air, the battle continued to rage over MiG Alley. But in Washington and at Far East Air Force's headquarters in Tokyo, a different kind of battle was being waged, a battle of wits, psychology, and greed. The Americans knew the Soviets had captured an F-86. Intelligence sources confirmed that Captain Garrett's Sabre had been spirited away to Moscow. The question burning in every planner's mind was simple: what did the Soviets learn? And more importantly, how could the Americans get their hands on a MiG-15 in return? The answer was Operation Moolah, a name that left little to the imagination. It was perhaps the most audacious psychological operation of the Korean War. The premise was brilliantly simple: offer communist pilots a fortune to defect with their jets. The idea had murky origins. Some credited a captain in the Army's psychological warfare branch named Alan Abner. Others pointed to a war correspondent who planted a fictional interview suggesting the reward, hoping the military would pick it up. By November 1952, the concept had wound its way through the Pentagon, the State Department, and back to the Far East, where General Mark Clark gave it a name and a mission. The terms were astonishing. Any pilot who delivered a fully operational MiG-15 to United Nations forces would receive $100,000, roughly $1 million in today's currency. The first pilot to defect would get an additional $50,000 bonus. Beyond the money, the offer included political asylum, resettlement in any non-communist country, and complete anonymity if desired. It was, in the words of one planner, a silver bullet aimed at the heart of communist air power. On April 26, 1953, as armistice negotiations dragged on at Panmunjom, the operation was launched. Under the cover of darkness, B-29 superfortresses droned north toward the Yalu River. Their bomb bays opened not to drop explosives, but to release 1.2 million leaflets over communist airfields at Sinuiju and Weiju. The leaflets were works of psychological art. They depicted a MiG-15 landing safely at a South Korean airbase, with a smiling pilot counting stacks of cash. In Korean, Chinese, and Russian, the text promised wealth, freedom, and a new life. Simultaneously, 14 radio stations in Japan and South Korea beamed General Clark's voice across the border, to all brave pilots who wish to free themselves from the communist yoke and start a new, better life with proper honor. You are guaranteed refuge, protection, humane care, and attention. The effect was immediate, and not what the Americans had hoped. For 8 days, the skies over MiG Alley fell silent. Not a single MiG rose to challenge the Sabre patrols. At first, American pilots celebrated. Then the intelligence officers realized what was happening. The communists were grounding their pilots, screening them for loyalty, hunting for potential defectors. A mysterious radio jamming transmitter began blocking all Russian-language broadcasts of Clark's offer. Chinese and Korean broadcasts continued unhindered, but the message intended for Soviet pilots, the ones America really wanted, was being deliberately silenced. The MiGs eventually returned to the sky. But something had changed. The paint schemes on communist aircraft were suddenly different. The red stars of the Soviet Air Force had vanished, replaced entirely by Chinese and North Korean markings. The Kremlin was erasing any evidence of its involvement, even as its pilots continued to fly and die over Korea. And then, on July 27, 1953, the guns fell silent.
An armistice was signed. The war was over, officially.
But Operation Moolah, it seemed, had failed. No pilot had defected. No MiG had been delivered. The $100,000 reward went unclaimed. But history had one final twist to deliver. 56 days after the ceasefire, on a crisp autumn morning, a lone MiG-15 appeared over South Korea. It flew low, slow, and deliberately. No evasive maneuvers, no aggressive posturing. Air defense radar operators watched in confusion as the aircraft crossed the border and headed straight for Kimpo Air Base, the sprawling American installation near Seoul. On the ground, soldiers scrambled. Was this an attack?
A last-ditch suicide mission? Anti-aircraft gunners tracked the bogey, fingers hovering over triggers.
But the MiG kept coming, its landing gear descending, its approach steady and professional. The wheels touched down on the Kimpo runway at 11:24 a.m. The jet rolled to a stop near a line of F-86 Sabres, the very aircraft it had been built to destroy.
For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the canopy slid open.
The pilot who climbed out was 21 years old. His name was No Kum-sok, a senior lieutenant in the North Korean Air Force. He was young, brilliant, and disillusioned. Born in Japanese-occupied Korea, he had watched his country traded from one empire to another. He had been trained by the Soviets, had flown the MiG-15 in combat, and had seen enough. In his flight suit, he carried a folded map of South Korea, a small pocket knife, and the address of his uncle in Seoul, a man he hadn't seen since the war began. He had no idea Operation Moolah existed. He hadn't seen the leaflets, hadn't heard the radio broadcasts. He had acted entirely on his own, driven by a private desperation to escape. As American personnel swarmed the aircraft, the the magnitude of the moment sank in. This was not just a defection. This was a treasure. The MiG-15 sitting on the Kimpo tarmac was pristine, fully fueled, fully armed, its engine still ticking as it cooled. Every rivet, every wire, every secret of Soviet aviation technology was now exposed to American eyes. No Kum-sok was whisked away for debriefing. He would later change his name to Kenneth Rowe, emigrate to the United States, and become an American citizen, eventually teaching engineering at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He received the $100,000 reward, though he had never known it existed when he made his desperate flight. The MiG itself was quickly dismantled, loaded onto a C-124 Globemaster, and flown to Okinawa for examination. From there, it continued to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where American engineers did exactly what the Soviets had done 2 years earlier. They took it apart, studied every system, measured every component, and learned its secrets. The intelligence gleaned from No Kum-sok's MiG confirmed what pilots had suspected. The MiG-15 was indeed formidable, light, powerful, with a deadly cannon armament. But it also had weaknesses: poor pilot visibility, heavy controls at high speed, and a gunsight that required skill and luck to use effectively. American tactics were refined. American pilots gained confidence. The technological balance, tipped by Popeliaf's cannon fire in 1951, had finally been restored. As for the men at the heart of this story, their paths would diverge in ways neither could have imagined. Yevgeny Popeliaf, the Soviet ace who fired the shots that brought down Garrett's Sabre, returned home a hero. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, promoted to colonel, and eventually became a test pilot. In 1995, long after the Cold War ended, he was invited to Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama for the Gathering of Eagles program, a celebration of aviation legends. There, he shook hands with the American aces he had once hunted, men like Gabby Gabreski and Robinson Reisner. The enemies of MiG Alley, united in peace. Gill Garrett, the man who ejected from that crippled Sabre over Sikosen Bay, survived the war and returned to his family. He lived quietly, grateful for the 3 extra missions he never had to fly. And No Kum-sok, the young lieutenant who landed at Kimpo, lived out his days in Florida, a free man in a free country. When asked why he did it, he would later write, "I was willing to risk my life for freedom. There was no other way." In the end, the story of the Sabre and the MiG is not just a story of technology or tactics. It is a story of men who climbed into cockpits on cold October mornings, who chased and were chased, who shot and were shot. It is a story of secrets and lies, of a war that never officially happened fought by pilots who never officially existed. And it is a story of how a single moment, a perfectly aimed burst of cannon fire over a frozen river, can change the course of history, sending ripples across continents and decades. The jets are museum pieces now. The pilots are gone, their voices silent. But if you listen closely on a quiet day, you can still hear them: the ghostly roar of engines over MiG Alley, the crackle of radio static, the heartbeat of young men gambling with death at 40,000 feet. And somewhere, in the silence between the stars, 2 jets still dance their eternal duel.